Alright, welcome to today's video. And in today's video, we want to introduce the cranial nerves. Okay, but before we do that, we are going to have um, an overview of the nervous system in general to help us to understand the cranial nerves better. Okay, now the nervous system is the body's communication and control network. Okay, so basically it receives information, processes the information, and produces responses. Okay, so every movement you make, every sensation you feel, every thought you have, and even automatic activities like heartbeat and gland secretion depend on the nervous system. Okay, so the nervous system is divided into the central nervous system, okay, and the peripheral nervous system. Now the central nervous system is further divided into the brain and the spinal cord, while the peripheral nervous system is further divided into the cranial nerves, the spinal nerves, and ganglia. Okay, so a ganglia is basically a collection of cell bodies, okay, outside the central nervous system. Now, apart from the ganglia, we can also have um, peripheral nerve and endings, okay, to make up part of the peripheral nervous system, right? Now, the peripheral nervous system functionally now can be divided into the sensory division or the afferent division and the motor division or the efferent division. So this is the peripheral nervous system, okay, and its functional division or functional classification now is into the sensory division and motor division. Okay, now the sensory division can further be divided into somatic sensory and visceral sensory, right? While the motor division or efferent division can further be divided into somatic nervous system and autonomic nervous system. Okay, so the somatic nervous system is voluntary and the autonomic nervous system is involuntary. And the autonomic nervous system can further be divided into sympathetic, which has to do with fight or flight, and parasympathetic, which has to do with rest and digest. Okay, so this is the functional division of the peripheral nervous system. All right, so the next thing that we want to see is the difference between a neuron, a nerve fiber, a nerve. Okay, and then we're also going to see the difference between a ganglion and a nucleus. Now, a neuron is also called a nerve cell, okay, and is the basic functional unit of the nervous system. So it consists of a cell body, dendrites and axons. So let's see a diagram of a neuron. Now this is the diagram of a nerve cell, okay, or a neuron, okay, and we say that it is the functional unit of the nervous system, okay, and it consists of the cell body, also known as the soma. It consists of the dendrites and it consists of an axon. So the function of a nerve cell basically involves receiving signals, which is done by the dendrites, processing these signals, which is done by the cell body, and passing impulses, conducting impulses, okay, to other parts of the nervous system, right? So which is done by the axon. All right, so that is for the nerve cell or the neuron. Now when you talk about a nerve fiber, Now let's look at a nerve fiber. Now this is a nerve fiber. Okay, so the nerve fiber majorly consists of the axon of a neuron. Okay, plus it's covering you know the myelin sheath. So this is a nerve fiber. Okay, now basically a nerve fiber conducts electrical impulses. All right, now when we talk about a nerve is a bundle of many nerve fibers that are traveling together outside the central nervous system. Okay, so a nerve is a bundle of nerve fibers, okay, that are traveling together outside the central nervous system. So you see a nerve fiber, so when they come in bundles, okay, so they make up a nerve. All right, now previously we talked about a ganglion, and we said a ganglion is a collection of cell bodies, a collection of neuron cell bodies outside the nervous system. Okay, but when you have a collection of neuron cell bodies inside the nervous system, it is called a nucleus. All right, so that's the difference between a ganglion and a nucleus. Okay, so now that we understand these basic structures, so we can now discuss the cranial nerves. Now the cranial nerves are peripheral nerves, okay, that arise directly from the brain or brainstem. Okay, so there are 12 pairs of cranial nerves, so mainly supplying the head, the neck, and special sense organs. Okay, so even though they originate from the brain, they are classified as part of the peripheral nervous system because they extend outside the central nervous system. Okay, so the 12 cranial nerves include the cranial nerve 1, the olfactory nerve, the cranial nerve 2, the optic nerve, cranial nerve 3, oculomotor nerve, cranial nerve 4, trochlear nerve, cranial nerve 5, trigeminal nerve, cranial nerve 6, abducens nerve, cranial nerve 7, facial nerve, cranial nerve 8, vestibulocochlear nerve, cranial nerve 9, glossopharyngeal nerve, cranial nerve 10, vagus nerve, cranial nerve 11, the accessory nerve, and cranial nerve 12, the hypoglossal nerve. So these are the 12 um, pairs of cranial nerve that we have. Okay. Now let's talk about the origin of these cranial nerves. Now every cranial nerve is said to have two origins. Okay. So you have the true origin or the deep origin. The origin of the cranial nerve. So we have number one, the true origin or the deep origin. And we also have the apparent origin. The apparent origin. Okay, now when we talk about the deep origin or the true origin, now this is the actual source of the nerve fibers. All right. So motor nerve fibers will arise from motor nuclei in the brain. Okay, while sensory nerve fibers will have their cell bodies. Okay, they will have their cell bodies in sensory ganglia outside the brain. Okay, so remember we said that a ganglia is a collection of cell bodies outside the central nervous system, right? So these sensory fibers will have their cell bodies, okay, in sensory ganglia outside the brain. All right, so this will be their true origin. Okay, so this ganglia will be their true origin because they are nerve fibers, okay, and their cell bodies, okay, are located outside the central nervous system. That's for the deep origin of the cranial nerves. So I hope we understood that part. Now when we talk about the apparent origin, So we are talking about the visible point where the nerve is coming out from the surface of the brain. Okay. So we have a diagram here to show us the emergence of the cranial nerve, or the exit point, or the apparent origin of the cranial nerves. Okay. So where each nerve is actually coming out from the brain. So we have the forebrain. Okay, so two nerves are actually coming out from the forebrain. So we are having the olfactory nerve and the optic nerve. So for the midbrain, we have the trochlear nerve that is emerging from the dorsal part of the midbrain, and we have the oculomotor nerve that is emerging from the ventral part of the midbrain. Okay, so for the pons, we have the trigeminal nerve that is emerging from the lateral aspect of the pons. Okay, then we have the pontomedullary junction, the junction between the pons and the medulla. So we have three nerves emerging from the pontomedullary junction. Okay, so we have the abducens nerve, the facial nerve, and the vestibulocochlear nerve. Okay, so let's see another diagram. So the abducens nerve is most medial. Okay, then we have the facial nerve next, and the vestibulocochlear nerve is most lateral. Okay, so next we have the nerves that are emerging from the medulla. Okay, so four nerves emerge from the medulla. We have the glossopharyngeal nerve, the vagus nerve, the accessory nerve, and the hypoglossal nerve. So this is the apparent origin of the cranial nerve. Two cranial nerves emerge from the forebrain. Two cranial nerves emerge from the midbrain. Four cranial nerves emerge from the pons. Actually, one emerged from the pons and three from the pontomedullary junction, and four cranial nerves emerge from the medulla. All right, so you can use this to remember how the cranial nerves emerge from the brain. Okay, now we want to talk about another important concept called um, the functional components of the cranial nerves. Okay, I want to talk about another important concept called the functional components of the cranial nerves. Okay, so essentially, the functional component just tells you the kind of information that um, a nerve fiber is carrying. Okay, so we know what a nerve fiber is. So, and we know that each cranial nerve is made up of a bundle of nerve fibers. Okay, so the functional components basically tell what kind of information that a particular nerve fiber is carrying. Okay, so if for example you take the facial nerve, for example, so the facial nerve performs a variety of function, like moving facial muscles, carrying taste sensation, controlling tears and saliva. So it means that the facial nerve contains different types of fibers. Okay, and these fibers perform different functions. Okay, so each type of fiber performing different functions, this make up the functional components. Okay, I hope we understood that. All right, so essentially we have 7 possible functional components that can be found in the cranial nerves. Okay, so 3 are motor components or efferent components, while 4 are sensory components. Okay, or afferent components. Okay, afferent. Okay, so the motor components are the general somatic efferent, right? The special visceral efferent, and the general visceral efferent. Okay, while the sensory components include the general somatic afferent, the special somatic afferent, the general visceral afferent, and the special visceral afferent. Okay, so essentially, a nerve fiber can either carry a motor information or a sensory information. Okay, so that's why we have the efferent components and the afferent component. So we've talked about efferent and afferent. So next we can see in these functional components we can see somatic and visceral. You can either have somatic or visceral. Okay, so somatic simply means the body wall, the body wall structures, usually the skin or skeletal muscles. Okay, while visceral means internal organs, okay, or automatic body functions. Okay, so the next that we can see, we can either have the general or special. Okay, so the general simply means ordinary functions that are found throughout the body. Okay, while the special simply means special senses mainly found in the head. Okay, so that's what this general, we can either have general or special. Okay, so these special components are basically or majorly found in the head. Okay, so as a matter of fact, the spinal nerves, okay, we talked about in classifying the peripheral nervous system. We talked about the cranial nerves, which we are dealing with now, and we also talked about the spinal nerves. So it's important to note that the spinal nerve has just four functional components. Okay, so which is the general somatic efferent, the general visceral efferent, the general somatic afferent, and the general visceral afferent. So these general components can be found in the spinal nerves. So in addition to these general components, the cranial nerves also carry special components. Okay, so that's how we have the special visceral efferent, the special somatic afferent, and the special visceral afferent. Okay, so we have four general components and three special components in the cranial nerves. So now let's talk about the motor components. So the motor components, we have the general somatic efferent. So the general somatic efferent simply means motor fibers, to the ordinary skeletal muscles. Okay, motor fibers to ordinary skeletal muscles. So the next motor component is the special visceral efferent. So this simply means motor fibers to muscles that are derived from pharyngeal arches. Okay, so embryologically, the muscles that are derived from pharyngeal arches, okay, like muscles of chewing, okay, muscles of facial expression, so they are supplied by the special visceral efferent components. Okay, so the next we have is the general visceral efferent. Okay, so this simply means motor fibers that are going to the organs and glands. Okay, motor fibers that are going to the organs and glands. So essentially they are parasympathetic fibers and they control things that you do not consciously control, like heart rate, digestion, saliva, and all that. Okay, so that's for general visceral efferent. Now let's move to the sensory components. Okay, now the general somatic afferent simply means ordinary sensations from the body, okay, or skin. Okay, so that's for the general somatic afferent. So the special somatic afferent, okay, so these fibers are special senses. Okay, they collect information from special senses, okay, like vision, like hearing, and balance. Okay, so for the general visceral afferent, so these fibers collect sensory information that are coming from organs. Okay, general visceral afferent. These fibers collect information that are coming from organs. Okay, so talking about the special visceral afferent. So the special visceral afferent, control or collect the taste and smell senses. Okay, and the taste and smell senses are called visceral in this case because they are related to feeding, related to digestion. Okay, and embryologically they are linked to visceral functions. Okay, so that is for that. So I believe you understood the functional components of the cranial nerves. Now it's very important for us to note that a cranial nerve can be sensory, can be purely sensory. A cranial nerve can be purely motor, and a cranial nerve can also be mixed. Okay, so a cranial nerve is said to be purely sensory. Okay, if it contains only afferent fibers. Okay, so and a cranial nerve is said to be purely motor if it contains only efferent fibers. Okay, so while a mixed cranial nerve contains both sensory fibers and motor fibers. All right, so this is a mnemonic to always remember which nerve is um which cranial nerve is sensory and which is motor. Okay, so it's some say marry money, but my big brother says big brain matters more. Okay, so cranial nerve 1 is sensory, cranial nerve 2 is sensory, cranial nerve 3 is motor, cranial nerve 4 is motor, cranial nerve 5 is mixed, cranial nerve 6 is motor, cranial nerve 7 is mixed, cranial nerve 8 is sensory, cranial nerve 9 is mixed, cranial nerve 10 is mixed, cranial nerve 11 is motor, and cranial nerve 12 is motor. Right, so some say marry money, so sensory, motor, both, motor, both, sensory, both, motor and motor. Okay, so that is for the mnemonic to always remember which cranial nerve is sensory and which is motor. So the purely sensory ones, we have the olfactory nerve, the optic nerve, and the vestibulocochlear nerve. So the purely motor ones, we have the oculomotor, the trochlear, the abducens, the accessory, and the hypoglossal. And the mixed nerve that we have the trigeminal, the facial, the glossopharyngeal, and the vagus. Okay, so in other words, the purely motor cranial nerves can have only these motor components, so it can be one, okay, or more than one, while the purely sensory cranial nerves will have the just these afferent components. Okay, so it could be one or more than one. Okay, while the mixed cranial nerve can have both the motor components and the sensory components. All right, so we've come to the end of this video, and in this video we've introduced the cranial nerves. So I hope that it made sense. Okay, I hope it was well explained. So if it was, please subscribe to the YouTube channel and share this video to others so they can learn. So thank you so much for watching the video, and see you in my next video.